I'm not particularly well again. Another bout of depression. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to do and have to kind of focus my efforts where they're most needed, or I have commitments and so on. But in the spirit of destigmatizing mental health issues, let's talk it all over again. It's also somewhat therapeutic to talk to people, even if they're not here. You know, that's part of the reason I have my YouTube channel. Adds structure to my day, and it's therapeutic. I get to talk, because I'm normally alone a lot of the time. So how is this manifesting, this depression? I have no energy, no matter how much caffeine or other energizing substances I consume. Nothing illegal, don't worry. I can't be bothered with anything. Cooking, washing, personal hygiene, anything really. Yeah, that's another reason I have the YouTube channel, because normally I have to get up, get dressed, get clean-ish, get in front of the camera and be presentable. Yeah, so it helps add that structure to my day. But I just can't be bothered. The garden, the yard for Americans, is massively overgrown, which I don't mind because it's good for the wildlife, but I just look at it and it seems insurmountable, and I can't summon the effort to look after that. Or to hoover, or to clean. I have to force myself to do the dishes, and it all takes extra effort. I don't like the spoon analogy, having so many spoons per day. It's not accurate to my situation. For me, it's more like I have to drag around one of those old iron balls on a chain all the time. It's not that I have so many spoons, it's that everything takes an enormous amount of extra effort and will and time to do. Now, unlike a lot of my other bouts of depression, I can actually point to causes here. And weirdly, that's actually a bit of a relief, because when you know what is causing something, you can do something about it, generally. And it's more satisfying to know that there is something wrong, something that you can work on, something that you can do. At least if you can understand, if you can target something that's getting you down. Well, I'm not necessarily sure that I can do anything about any of these things, but at least I know what it is, to an extent. And it's not COVID. The situation of being in lockdown is pretty much my normal day-to-day life. It's what I expect, it's what I'm used to. And some good things have come out of the lockdown. I've started streaming games, which is something I meant to do for ages, but I was unable to motivate myself to do. How was I able to motivate myself to do it? By telling myself that I'm doing it for other people, to give them something to do during lockdown, to keep them entertained, to make their travails slightly less unpleasant. And that's good. Yeah, that's something I've managed to do. I've had many opportunities. In many ways, the lockdown period has been one of the better periods for me. New work opportunities have arisen in areas different to the ones that I normally work in. I'm doing pretty well, but there's an element of guilt in that a lot of people aren't doing particularly well. I've tried to assuage that guilt by providing work for other people, paying for things that I don't necessarily need to pay for, or more than I would normally pay for work, stuff that I can channel back into games and so on. But a lot of that's a guilt and a sense of responsibility, a sense of charity almost, but being the kind of second guessing myself sort of guy that I am, I don't necessarily see that as a good thing. It could be seen as patronizing. So even in the efforts that I make to try and assuage that guilt, or guilt isn't quite the right word, concern, but even the efforts that I make end up getting spun by my diseased brain into something negative, even though intellectually I can say that I'm doing something good and I'm helping other people. It's a weird situation. I'm getting paid to run games now, to stream games with tabletopless. And that's given me an opportunity to do things that I've always wanted to do with games and with gaming. So, that's a huge thing. I've gotten involved with an art collective and their salon streams and doing video work, which is something that's strangely satisfying, but something I never thought that I would ever do. And that stemmed from my YouTube channel. It's so there's good stuff that's happened, but also bad things. We lost our cat during lockdown. He had bone cancer. The people who watch me and read me and listen to me were fantastic and raised a lot of money to help with the vet's bills and so on, but in the end it turned out to be bone cancer. There's not really much we could do about it. You gave me extra time with my cat, for which I'm endlessly grateful, but he's gone, and that's the cat that saved my life by interrupting me during a suicide attempt. So, feeling the depression now, I also feel like my little furry guardian angel is not around. We've got our other cat, which has softened the blow, and we're going to adopt another cat, but losing him in the midst of all this and being unable to be there with him as he went to sleep, that was hard. That was very, very painful. One of the weirdest things about COVID, though, is not having any actual alone time, because my wife is working from home. And so I'm in kind of the opposite situation to a lot of people, in that I'm not as isolated as I once was, and I find that weirdly difficult. We're mature enough to spend time apart within the house, but still, there's something about quietness and solitude that I'm very much missing. There's other things, obviously, that weigh on me. I've been under near constant attack from people since about 2010, and have this weird reputation, which is 180 degrees from my self-image and how I conduct myself and the things that I do. I feel very misunderstood, and as someone who communicates professionally as my job, that's hard to live with. Is it that I'm just a shit communicator who can't get things across to people? Or is it them? Is it the kids who are wrong? The children who are wrong? What's the case here? And there are people that do get me. There are people that do understand me. So where is the problem coming from? Is it cultural? Because it is mostly Americans who hate me. Is there some kind of divided by a common language thing going on? And this has particularly been the case since 2014, of course, when I was heavily involved in Gamergate, which has been inappropriately and incorrectly maligned as some sort of far-right movement, even though it was mostly kind of left libertarians, liberals, in the proper sense of the word. And that's been a slow-rolling sort of shifting of the sand beneath my feet, a paradigm earthquake, if you will. Because up until that point, I felt very much that myself and the creative communities of which I was a part were all pretty unified in that moral panics are bad, censorship is bad, we want our media to be ethical and honest, and so it was very earth-shaking to have all of those pleasant illusions torn away. Because no, it turns out that a very large segment of these creative communities is pro-censorship, is anti-ethics, doesn't care about these things, or at least prioritizes them well below identity politics, below the modern twisted version of feminism or race relations or whatever else. And we all suffer for that. You know, before you could point to some outside force, whether it be Pat Pulling in D&D, or whether it be Jack Thompson in computer games, this outside moral busybody who didn't understand what they were talking about, and certainly didn't understand the games or whatever else it was we were defending. But this time it's coming from inside, and that's such a total sense of betrayal that it's hard to convey just how unsettling and corrosive that was. I mean, I felt literally dizzy sometimes, finding out people who'd made things that could be considered problematic today, that was never their intent, to find them more than willing to cancel other people, to deplatform other people, to scream for something to be censored and controlled. And I had thought, of all communities that would be resistant to moral panic, that would be resistant to censorship, it would be the gaming community in particular. Even more so tabletop gaming. But no. And now I'm undergoing a second version of that, because as one community threw me out, another embraced me. I never really fit with that group. I never really fit with the right wing, but at least they were tolerant. At least they were tolerant of what I said, what I did, what I made, and were more supportive, and were at least open to the discussion. But now, 5 years later, and yeah, sure, people change. Economies fluctuate. Hairstyles change. Of course, things change, but a lot of these people in this new community are moving too far to the right, or becoming too anti-science or too vitriolic, to the point where it's not just a difference of a matter of opinion. And this flared up in the Inappropriate Characters podcast, where Pundit has become rather science denialist, has become a minimizer of the dangers of COVID, and this kind of desperate anti-science kind of pro-Trump stuff crossed the line from opinion to denying fact. And I didn't feel I could continue anymore, though best of luck to him. Or to see people in this looser, more libertarian, I guess, more small c conservative group who had been crowing about individual freedom and rights and so on, celebrating the election in Poland, in which they now have both an anti-LGBT president and an anti-LGBT government. Now, I would agree that there's a lot of overreach and issues in our nations around these things. Nonsense pronouns, laws defending nonsense pronouns, other issues. Perhaps we're being a little too forgiving in a way that we wouldn't if the situations or genders were reversed in a lot of this. But it's a different situation in Poland. And it's not, Poland isn't based for electing these people. They don't have civil partnerships. They deny a lot of rights already to their LGBT community. It's not the same paradigm. It's not the same situation that we're in. People are being denied their rights. They are under threat. And that one of the arguments that someone gave was that LGBT rights are not under threat in Poland because we never gave them any rights. That's ludicrous. And we shouldn't turn a blind eye to genuine oppression. So that term ends up being overused and watered down, but we shouldn't turn a blind eye to oppression in Poland or Hungary or Turkey just because you happen to agree with them on some other point. There's not much that I agree with them on, differences of opinion again, but when it comes to Poland, people are genuinely under threat, and it's not the overblown rhetoric that we get here in the first world fully developed countries that aren't the ex-Warsaw Pact ones. So I'm undergoing a second shift. I don't feel like I fit anywhere. I don't feel like anyone has my back. I don't feel like I can trust anyone not to suddenly turn into a swivel-eyed loon on me. And a lot of these people that are accused of being in some kind of YouTube far-right funnel, they started out as pretty moderate, left-wing, liberal people. And I think people have the relationship the wrong way round. It's not that they lead their audience to the right, it's that their audience leads them to the right. Because that's the audience. That's the people who want the content. That's those who are willing to pay for it. And it's the more outrageous, the more edgy, the more conservative points of view that get those views. They get those clicks. So I think people have the relationship mirrored there. There's nuance to things. I see nuance in issues, and we live in a very black and white age where people are all or nothing, black or white, right or wrong. Things are complicated. Very few things are black and white. You can always think of a situation, a context, in which something that would normally be bad is good, or something that is normally good would be bad. And this acceptance that the world is complicated, that issues are nuanced, and that we should examine that nuance, that gets you attacked by both sides. Right? Take trans issues. Somehow, weirdly, I'm considered to be anti-trans, even though I've given work to trans people. One of my best friends in the world is a trans man, a disabled trans man. At that, I work with a beautiful trans lady on Tabletopless. I've shown no bias, one way or the other, to employing anyone who's trans or not. But what I do have is a nuanced view of the issues, in that sex is an immutable characteristic. There's a biological genuineness to sex, and that to me is the tragedy of transgenderism, that you feel yourself to be something that you are not, and so you seek to address it through hormones, surgery, affectation, whatever else it might be. So I sympathize, I understand, and I want the best for them. I want people to have as equal rights as there is possible, given biology. I want people to be treated the way they want to be treated, in so much as is possible, so long as the benefit outweighs the cost. But that's not good enough for the trans activists, and it's not good enough for the TERFs, right? Even though it's an acknowledgement of a reality, while at the same time extending empathy, compassion, concern, and a desire for people to have as equal rights as possible, which surely is a good position to take, right? Because you can't find a solution to a problem without acknowledging the reality of the problem. But it seems not. And there's racial issues which have flared up again. And somehow it's gotten around that I'm supposedly a known racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body, but then do people mean racism when they say racism, or do they mean something else? Because some people say it's prejudice plus power, and some people say some forms of racism don't require you to be personally racist in any way, shape or form. You can't help it, which is ironically a rather racist point of view since they apply it to white people. I've always, in as much as it's possible in such a racially homogenous country, I've always had friends from other races, and it has never mattered a jot. It's not something I factor in. But then that can be considered racist. But it didn't used to be, right? The point is that you treat everyone the same. You treat them as individuals. But that's not good enough. Now you have to center race, which to me is anathema because that leads to racism. And I have friends who are unfortunately steeped in all of these sort of grievance studies things and use the language of grievance studies and say they want to have conversations about race, but they want them to be one-sided conversations about race. And when I try to engage in good faith, somehow it always just makes things worse. And then they wonder why you don't want to engage on those matters. And there is no space in those discussions for my experiences, my interpretations, the instances of racism that I've suffered. Because, yeah, you can suffer from racism as a white dude. It does happen. It is possible. It's not plus power. It's just prejudice on the basis of race. But then when you can't communicate because the terminology is so fucked, and because there's no room for discussion. If you want to reach someone and persuade someone, you have to also understand their point of view as well as your own. And you have to moderate and compromise and find a way to reach and understand each other and come to an accommodation. That's how this is supposed to work. But there's no room for discussion. Any resistance, any pushback, any nuance is white fragility, another racist term. And fuck that, right? I'm anti-racism. I point out and call out genuine racism whenever I see it. And yet I find myself biting my tongue when the person committing the racist acts is someone from a racial minority, right? And that compromises my principles and my personal integrity to do so. And yet they will deny and deflect and redefine in order to avoid the label. But sorry, when you're talking about whiteness, you're being racist. When you talk about white fragility, you're being racist. And racist in the meaning of just prejudice on the basis of race. But there's all these other ideas washing around, like the very idea of reason or logic or discussion or moderation or debate or even just trying to find out what's true rather than just assuming what's true. These are also taken to be white supremacist ideas. But the thing about these processes, about science in particular, is that it works no matter what culture you're from, what colour your skin is. It's not white supremacist, it's reality supremacist, and reality has to be supreme. My intent doesn't matter. There is no steel manning, there is no charitable interpretation of anything that I say or do. Yeah, and give enough random sentences that someone has spoken aloud, stripping them of context, you can damn just about anyone. This mangling of language is particularly painful because I'm a communicator, because I'm a writer, because semantics are important, because precision is important. But people are not communicating in language, they're communicating in jargon. And there's a strain in constantly trying to decode and understand what people are saying when they're using terms that you also use in the everyday, right? So take systemic racism, for example. So systemic, referring to a system. typically a societal system in this context. And racism, to most of us, means prejudice on the basis of race. So when you talk about systemic racism, most of us are going to decode that as meaning like the laws and the structure of the society are set up with segregation or apartheid, or that people of a certain race are treated differently, in law, in the system, in the way that it works. But that's not what they mean. Right? To understand systemic racism, you have to understand that nobody at any level of the system actually, individually, has to be racist. It's just that the system tends to affect people of a particular group more, and that's it. Right? There need be no racial animus, there need be no prejudice for this to be the case. So systemic racism is not actually systemic racism. It's, hey, this particular policy or whatever it might be affects people from this group disproportionately, and that's unfair. Okay, but is it, if you're being universalist? There are going to be consequences. Understanding it as racism or trying to prosecute it as racism, there's just going to force resistance. Whereas if you say, hey, this system is unfair, it's affecting these people in a different way, then maybe you can find a line to reform without making people so defensive. But then racism itself, as we've covered, is redefined. It's no longer prejudice on the basis of race, it's prejudice plus power. And yet, if you look to the confrontations that there have been around statues and so on, who has the power? Is it BLM or is it the football lads who are poor and powerless and relatively uneducated and yet undeniably racist, as are a lot of the black nationalists? Unfortunately, they regard white people as subhuman, and yet we're constrained from pointing that out, except when it dips into anti-Semitism. So I guess in some ways, thank goodness they are also virulently anti-Semitic, because otherwise we'd have no way to push back against these frankly ludicrous ideas that are just as obscene, just as dangerous, just as nasty as the same views held by genuine white supremacists. But constantly trying to decode the language, being forced to be a hypocrite, is extremely wearing day by day by day. In the past, I've used stoicism as a coping mechanism, and it wasn't a particularly healthy one. I've never been particularly conventionally masculine, I suppose. Intellectual, artistic, always with my head in a book, or doodling, or writing, or doing something like that. The one thing that I felt was truly and genuinely masculine about me was my ability to just bear the strain, bear the load. And for a long time that did work. But eventually, everyone reaches their snapping point. And so I no longer tend to use stoicism as a coping mechanism. This is part of the reason I got into men's issues, I suppose. I found that there wasn't a great deal of emotional support or a great deal of professional support for men struggling with mental health issues, amongst other things. Though I find that the people concerned with men's issues are also sliding to the right and becoming something that I can no longer comfortably associate myself with. It's no longer really about equality and fairness for men any more than modern feminism is any more about equality and fairness for women. It's dispiriting to see them making the same mistakes. Instead, I seem to have latched on to principle. But is principle just another coping mechanism? And am I taking it to an unhealthy extent? Intuitively, I don't feel that that's the case. I feel that principles are important. But most people don't, and they compromise all the time. Like, they'll say They believe in innocence until proven guilty, but they'll make an exception if it's their friend who accuses someone, or their friend who's accused, one way or the other. And by not doing that, by not going along with the social connections and instead going on principled axioms, that seems to aggravate a lot of people. And yet, at the end of the day, as I've said, the only person you have to be able to live with is yourself. And I find it very hard to live with myself if I violate my principles, even if it's ostensibly in a good cause or to keep the social situation ticking over. But is it another coping mechanism? I don't know. I think principles are important. Principles like universalism, maximal freedom, rationality, logic, reason, a requirement for evidence before you believe something. These are all important. But is that intellectualization also another coping mechanism? It's the one good thing I took from cognitive behavioral therapy was a sort of codified way to step back and examine a situation outside of the emotions that were in it. And that was considered a healthy way to do things, and it has certainly helped with my depression. But is that just another coping mechanism that could be taken to an unhealthy extent? Most of all, I hate the doubt and suspicion that I now have towards people, claims. Time was when you told me about some sex pest in some group or LARP or whatever, I would just believe you. But that has been eroded away to nothing by the abuse of accusations to destroy people's lives and careers, by high-profile false accusations. And yeah, I know they're not a huge number, but the abuse of these claims seems to be much higher. And people get ruined all the time over unproven accusations. And that can be uncomfortable because, again, nuance, people who are being accused often take me as being on their side, and people making the accusations often take me as being on the other side. But that's not it. It's a three-bladed sword. My side, your side, and the truth. Except me, I'm the one outside the situation looking for the truth. Yeah, I try to be charitable to people. I try to steelman people. I fail. Everyone fails at these things. But at least I'm making the effort, right? But all that gets you is condemned by everyone. But I hate that. I hate that I no longer trust people or trust what they say. That I feel I no longer can because people are abusing this atmosphere, this febrile moral panic atmosphere that has been going on longer than it should have. People abuse it to hurt their enemies or to disguise their own misdeeds. And so I feel constantly suspicious and watchful. So, this is what happens to me. I get into these spirals of self-consideration and rumination. And that's why when I do speak out on something, I'm usually fairly confident in it, because I have agonized over it internally for a long time before I've come to a position. And it's going to take something pretty radical to change that position. But it also leads to these spirals of dark mood. And I hate being misunderstood. I hate being suspicious of people. I hate one-sided conversations where I'm not allowed to participate. Which means it's not a conversation. And all of that's what's dragged me down.